make all of us less safe and make it more likely that there will be more shootings and more murder.
Gun violence activists are voicing their concerns about a proposal to let people carry concealed weapons in Michigan without a permit. Good evening, I'm Ann Emmerich. A series of 5 bills to eliminate permit requirements was introduced in the State House Tuesday. Lawmakers say these bills would establish Michigan as a constitutional carry state. News 10's Bobby Cushing joins us live in studio with both sides of this debate. Bobby.
Yeah, good evening, Ann. Lawmakers say these bills have been a long time coming, even claiming that current restrictions on concealed carry are unconstitutional. However, critics on the other side say a repeal of license requirements would make everyone less safe, from children to first responders. A series of 5 bills introduced at the Michigan Capitol would allow people in the state to carry concealed weapons without a permit. Ryan Bates, executive director at End Gun Violence Michigan, calls these bills a mistake that would make life less safe and lead to more gun deaths.
At the very least, we can make sure that the holder of that concealed carry permit is trained in our firearms laws and how to use that weapon.
He says these bills could also create challenges for law enforcement because police are most in danger when approaching an armed subject. However, Representative Mike Hoadley, who sponsors these bills, says they would focus on protecting the Second Amendment and the state constitution.
The Michigan Constitution, Article 1, Section 6 says, the citizen has the right to defend themselves and the state of Michigan.
The package of bills would also change the rules for where you are allowed to carry a concealed weapon. Right now, you can't bring a concealed pistol into places like hospitals, child care centers, places of worship, bars, and sports arenas. Under these bills, schools would be the only weapon-free zones left in the state.
When we've had these episodes of gun violence, they've taken place in these gun-free zones, or, as could be said, as, pretty much victim-rich environments for the criminal element.
But Bates says allowing guns into those spaces adds a new layer of uncertainty for the people there.
Instead of worrying about taking care of our children and our sick relatives, they're having to worry about armed people coming into their place of work.
Representative Hoadley says these are in the early stages of legislation and future changes to the bill could be welcomed. Now, Representative Hoadley told me one of the changes he could support would be a requirement for schools to offer a firearms safety class. Now, as far as where these bills stand, they were referred to the House Judiciary Committee. Ann.
Bobby, thank you. Now, if these bills were to pass, Michigan would become the 30th state in the country to have constitutional carry laws, joining states like Texas, Florida, and Indiana.